joining us. So my name is Steve Newell. I'm a project director at the Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues, also known as the EPICenter here at AAAS. So since April of 2019, we've been working on election security here at the EPICenter. We've primarily focused on three areas. So the election system themselves, post-election audits, and the future of voting. So in this work, we've been lucky enough to benefit from the expertise of our guests today. So Dr. Duncan Buell is the NCR Chair and Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of South Carolina. Dr. Buell's both academic and hands-on experience in electronic voting systems and elections. He's been a part of a team that is auditing election data in South Carolina and discovering problems in the process that can lead to uncounted votes in the absence of data to support the vote totals certified by the state. Since 2004, he's been working with the League of Women Voters in South Carolina on the subject of electronic voting machines, leading to the purchase and rollout of new machines and equipment across the state earlier this year. He's been a participant on a panel of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights regarding voting rights, and is also an active member of the Election Verification Network, a professional society of election officials, researchers, and advocates committed to accurate, accessible, transparent, reliable, and verifiable elections. So this session is primarily an Ask Me Anything, so share your voting related questions in the chat box and I'll go ahead and relay them to Dr. Buell. So to get started, I'll go ahead and ask a question or two to get us off. So Dr. Buell, to some extent, we've been talking about election security since 2016. Today, what are the security vulnerabilities in the election process do you think most people should know about?
I think the first major vulnerability that people should be aware of is in the voter registration database itself. And I've given a talk several times about the various places along the election process where there are vulnerabilities in the data. Most states these days have a version of the voter registration database online. So, for example, in South Carolina, I can sign on and look up my precinct information and who's going to be on my ballot and find out that sort of information. We would hope that that is not the only version, and we would hope that that is not the official version, because anything that is online is going to be attacked if it has value, and certainly a voter registration database would have value. So that's one of the big vulnerabilities. If you think about it, there are demographic areas in most states that vote one way or the other. And if one were to get into the voter registration database at the appropriate time and change several thousand addresses, for example, you would have several thousand voters who might lean strongly Democratic or strongly Republican who would be told they weren't registered or they were registered somewhere else. And by the time everybody went all across the county, they would get tired and they wouldn't vote. And this would be a way of suppressing the vote. I think that's probably the biggest vulnerability. The other big vulnerability is after polls close on election night, the central tabulation computer at the jurisdiction, usually a counter, is going to have the information. It is supposed to never be connected to the internet, but the media and the candidates and the state will want to know intermediate results, and the transfer of that information from an unconnected computer to a connected computer should be done with media like flash drives that only go one way and don't go back and forth. So I think those are the two big vulnerabilities that we know about.
So I think that brings me to the next question I have. So there's been a lot of discussions about how to keep elections safe from hackers. So one point which you just alluded to was a place where experts and election officials sometimes seem to be in disagreement about whether these election systems are connected to the internet. So what's really the disconnect in this conversation, and what are the concerns? You just alluded to that a little bit.
So I think I will preface my statement by saying that I've almost never talked to an election official that didn't come off sincere and well-meaning. But they aren't necessarily computer experts, and they aren't necessarily computer security experts. I think a lot of people think that simply by not plugging a computer into a wire connected to the wall, connected to the internet, they're keeping the computer off the internet. There is a current controversy right now in Florida because apparently the scanners that will scan optical ballots have wireless modems to communicate the results. Well, that wireless modem is going over the internet, and that could be hacked. It could be attacked, and it could be intercepted and changed on the way to county headquarters. So I think the disconnect. So now I will also say Kevin Skoglund up in Pennsylvania did a study with some friends, some colleagues of his, and they found some dozens of counties that had their tabulation computer connected to the internet, sometimes for weeks and months at a time. This is really dangerous. The other problem is just an assumption that if you do X, Y, and Z that you are supposed to do to maintain security, then you are in fact secure. And all that means is that you've made it a little harder to be attacked. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're secure. And I think whether this is hubris or complacency or genuine arrogance, it's not understanding that people will attack something if there is value. And you've got to just close every possible loophole. And I think a lot of election officials are just not aware of this, or they don't have the resources to do that.
Great. So another question I have is, have election systems been hacked in the US? And when people discuss hacking election systems, what aspects of election infrastructure are they usually talking about? You talked a little about the kind of wireless modems on tabulators and devices used for reporting, but are there other places of the election infrastructure that should, kind of worry about in terms of hacking? What are the systems that are normally being discussed in that context?
So DEF CON out in Las Vegas for the last couple of years has had a voting village, and they have had hardware, and everything that people have looked at, they have been able to find attacks for. They've been able to find entry points for. One of the most popular optical scanners, for example, I think had SRC as the password that would let you in and give you supervisor privileges. When Rabba Corporation with Mike Wertheimer looked at the Diebold system for the state of Maryland 15 years ago, I knew Wertheimer when he was an NSA cryptanalyst, one of the smartest guys I've ever met. And I think it took them like 17 seconds to hack into one of these Diebold machines, because the supervisor password that gave you God-level privileges hard-coded into the firmware of the machine, same for every Diebold voting machine ever built, was 1111. So yes, they can be attacked. Part of the argument always is that if you have to attack an individual voting computer, it can be harder to propagate the results in a way that will not be detected. If you can hack into the central tabulation computer that configures all of the computers for a given county, then it's a top-down introduction of malware, and that makes it very much easier.
Okay, so I'll ask one more question before jumping into the Q&A. So vote by mail has become a huge topic in the 2020 election. So what does the evidence say about the security issues of mail-in ballots?
So the evidence is that mail-in ballots are secure and a perfectly reasonable way of collecting votes from voters. The notion that some bad actor could print up 10,000 ballots and print up exactly the same envelopes that the election jurisdiction is using and somehow get those counted is just very, very naive. When people vote absentee, all the election jurisdictions I'm aware of keep track of the existence of votes. So corrupting an election would be extremely difficult. you could disrupt an election by somehow mimicking several thousand votes. So you'd have several thousand people who had apparently voted twice. But in terms of corrupting by introducing spurious votes, that's almost impossible. In my state, when I sent in my absentee ballot, my name and my registration number were on the outside of the outer envelope. I had to sign it. I needed a witness signature. So that enclosed the ballot envelope, which was inside and had a big thing said, "Ballot herein." And you check the signatures, you check off the voters with the outer envelopes, you save the inner envelopes until election day when you actually tabulate. It's a very, very secure process. The big question with regard to mail this election cycle is the expectation of so many more mail ballots than usual, which is a logistics and process issue for the election officials, but it's not a security issue.
Great, thanks, Duncan. So let's go ahead and jump into the Q&A. So one question from Abigail is, what were the voting machines that you would advocate for, or you did advocate for, to be used in this year's election in your state, South Carolina, and why?
I'm a computer science professor. I advocate for as little technology as is minimally necessary because elections are chaotic events. In my county, we send out 1,100 devices to 150 polling places run by people who don't do it every day. And election day, when it starts, has to work. So as a systems issue, the argument has to be to keep it as simple as possible. I advocate for human marked, human readable paper ballots. If the technology has to be there, the technology of optical scanners, if they're not connected to the internet, is pretty good because you can print up 1,000 test ballots with exactly the results you expect. And if you run them through the scanner and you don't get exactly the count that you expect, you know that the scanner is badly calibrated or there's a bug and you can fix it. But humans are actually pretty good at filling in bubbles. They can actually look at the English text. When you have a voting computer, like South Carolina now does, you have all of the issues of configuring the software. You have bugs in the software. And I've seen bugs in our previous system that never got fixed. So I'm a big advocate for human marked, hand marked, human readable paper ballots that voters can verify that get scanned at the precinct, because if you scan and get a count at the precinct, then you have a lot of small numbers that have to add up when you collect them all at county headquarters. I'm not a big fan of taking all the ballots back to county headquarters and totaling them there, because it's a lot easier to obscure somebody having dropped a box of ballots off the back of a truck, for example. If you've got a bunch of tiny counts, then anything at county headquarters that doesn't match all those tiny counts is going to be detected very quickly. We didn't do that in South Carolina. We bought the very expensive equipment that cost almost twice as much. Hand-marked paper ballots cost about half as much as an all-electronic system, which means you have all of that money that you can spend on improving the process, better training of poll workers, better other things elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen funding for elections be an ongoing point of contention. I think, election experts recommended about $4 billion in funding for election security this year, and Congress provided about $400 million, so about 1/10 of what we needed for election security funds this year. So still a lot of kind of unmet need across the country. So go ahead, Duncan.
I was just going to say, elections offices are part of the government. Government can only raise funds by taxing people, so it automatically becomes politically questionable. And for whatever reason, bad elections don't look as bad as potholes in the street. Everybody knows the potholes. Not everybody knows where the problems are and the scrimping and saving is done in an elections office.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one thing we've seen come up a lot, is just people's understanding of elections, how infrequent they are, and just the ability to kind of obscure some of those issues, and they're not as transparent as other kind of government-related issues. So one question from Mia Hendricks is, given that there's such confusion on this topic, can you speak to any ways to combat misinformation in the media or social media? Or really, I think a broader question is, what can, kind of committed citizens do to combat misinformation in voting?
I would like to believe that the truth will out eventually. And I think it is hard. There's a lot of misinformation. There are conspiracy theories. There's social media stuff that goes viral. The best answer really maybe is talk to the local election official in your county or jurisdiction, get from them what their statement is, and try to disseminate that when you have a chance. I've been involved in working with people who espoused conspiracy theories, or working to refute conspiracy theories, and it can be really hard. As I was saying before this whole thing started, in 2012, we had a very, very bad election in my county. And I was the one who showed that it was really a management screw up. It wasn't a conspiracy, but we still hear people saying that there was a conspiracy. And I was standing in line voting once, and somebody, 2 or 3 people behind me, commented about the conspiracy. And I said, no, there was no conspiracy. Trust me, I did the numbers. And I think that's the best we can do. Social media is both good and bad. And I think the best we can do is to become informed and to try to inform others when there's a chance.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of seen this with vote by mail, where it's become, this large point of contention, but there's really not much evidence at all supporting vote by mail as a contentious voting issue, or, an issue where there's a lack of security. It's incredibly, rare to see any fraud in elections. That, of course, carries over to vote by mail. So a question from George Smith here. So in Missouri, nonpartisan redistricting is on the ballot in November. Can you comment on the efficiency gap as a measure of partisan drawing of legislative districts, or can you kind of talk to, kind of redistricting in general? Of course, that's going to be a concern as, we kind of move through the next several years. A lot of states are kind of looking at those types of issues.
I can say a little bit. I cannot say that I'm an expert on that. I have worked. We have an applied math professor, Matt Saltzman, up at Clemson University, who supervised a couple of master's degrees on the redistricting issue for South Carolina, and basically doing a very large number of simulations where he pushes precincts back and forth across jurisdiction lines and then measures the extent to which that skews the vote. I wanted to do efficiency gap computations on the South Carolina data, and I was unable to do that because we didn't have enough contested elections. Unfortunately, in South Carolina, things are so gerrymandered that 3/4 of our state legislative people go into the general election with no opposition, or with an opposition that is token. If you've got a 90-10 split one way or the other, trying to do an efficiency gap measure is not sensible. I will also mention that in one of the meetings that I had with with the League of Women Voters and with Dr. Saltzman and the staffers for the South Carolina State House and Senate who were going to be doing redistricting, we were told that in the South Carolina law, it is not permitted to use any mathematical estimate of fairness. So if that's written into Missouri law, then you're going to have trouble applying it. You're going to have to find a way around calling it Redistricting is difficult because the incumbents will want to stay in office. So they would like to have an assurance that they're going to have the voters who would vote for them. They will also want to move districts around to make sure their big donors stay in their district. So that's a really difficult issue, but there are people, probably the best people for that are the people coming out of Tufts. Moon Duchin has been running a number of workshops around the country to bring up the skills level of people who can do the analysis of redistricting to make it more effective and better information when you start talking with policymakers. So I don't have a really good answer for that one, but there is an answer out there. And as I say, I think Moon Duchin and the people she's been working with out of Tufts probably are the best in the country for doing that.
Great, thanks, Duncan. I mean, that's a really challenging issue because of, the political considerations, the economic considerations in terms of, kind of funding and donors and things like that. So I think those are questions that we'll continue to see over the next several years as, the kind of census results begin to influence these things as well. So.
And yes, and as a science problem, it's one of these really impossible optimization things. You push a precinct to cross a line to increase the number of voters in one jurisdiction. You have to push a different precinct out to take those out to balance. So it's a really squishy optimization problem, which is why it takes a lot of computing to actually get answers, but it can be done. Computers are pretty good these days.
Great. So we have another question from Perla. So what role do you see for political party and campaign databases playing and serving as a check on attacks against official election infrastructure? So she says, for example, parties maintain their own voter list sourced from official election lists with value-added data and often record voters in real time at the polls via poll watchers. So what role do you see for political parties in kind of serving as a check on these attacks and concerns about kind of election malfeasance?
Certainly in the states where voters do register by party, the two largest parties should have data that is consistent with the state data. So that would serve as a check. In South Carolina, we do not register by party. So the only record is which primary, and we have open primaries. So the only record is which primary a voter has happened to have voted in. And so I think having a second set of data that is supposed to be consistent with the official data probably is a good thing. And this is just because it's such a big problem, maintaining these databases. Voters change addresses, voters move, voters register. Having somebody else as a third party providing a check is a really good thing. Political parties will do it probably for their own purpose, but if both of the major political parties do it, then at least you have a check on them in opposition to each other. So I would think that's a really good thing. Some of the analysis I have done of the South Carolina results has been not necessarily on the voter registration database, but on the results. I have basically run the numbers and compared them against the official results. And I get a lot of good responses from people that it's nice that somebody else has access to the data, because that way you don't have to simply trust the election officials. Years ago, when I called Carolyn Cernich, who was clerk of court in Humboldt County, California, about the question of transparency, and her statement to me was something I used in my deposition. She said, "I don't ever want to tell my voters, just trust me." And I think that kind of transparency is a good thing.
Yeah, I guess kind of following with this point of trusting the outcomes, could you talk a little about post-election audits. I think that's something that hasn't come up so far.
So the big trend now is for the adoption of what are called risk limiting audits, which is an idea that Phil Stark at Cal Berkeley, who's a statistics professor and associate dean, I guess now, developed. If you have paper after the election, then you can statistically sample the paper with a risk limiting audit until your friendly neighborhood statistician tells you that the result you got is supported by the statistics. And several states have begun adopting risk limiting audits, some of them statewide for a particular contest, some of them statewide for all things. This is gradually becoming more normal, and I think it's a really good thing. I think my understanding in South Carolina is that our post-election audit is simply to be directed to hand count the votes from one particular precinct. Now, that helps, but that's not something with statistical confidence. That doesn't give you evidence, which is the E in EPI, right? And I remember in Colorado, prior to their adoption of RLAs, when they were using electronic voting computers, the Secretary of State would direct each county to count the details of, I think, 5% of the voting computers they used. There have been rules like this in the past. Ohio and California required 1% or 3%, and I forget which was which, of either all of the ballots or the ballots from some number of precincts. So there has been a lot of auditing in the past, but the gold standard now would be a risk limiting audit. And unless the race is really, really tight, it's not a time-consuming or expensive process, and it gives you evidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of, going along with your earlier comment on election officials not wanting to say, just trust me. Post-election audits are a very effective check to provide evidence on the kind of counting process, tabulating process. So, as of last count, 34 states have some type of audit in place, which shows that not every state does. There's still a lot of states that are lacking those. So could you talk a little about, the kind of concerns in those places, or the kind of, you mentioned some about risk limiting audits. What do we need to kind of know about audits across the country?
Well, the first thing I think is to understand what the audit process is in one's own state. And this brings up one of the problems that has become a big deal in this election, and that is almost anything that you hear on the national news doesn't apply to you in your own state, because the 50 states and the district, the other jurisdictions, all have different rules. And something on national news will be news because it's an anomaly, but almost certainly your state has a different set of regulations. So Colorado, I think, pioneered the concept of requiring RLAs. California has been requiring them in some elections, and people like Phil Stark have traveled to various locations to observe the RLA. I think pushing for more post-election auditing is a good thing. I think this is something citizens ought to push for. And it's not necessarily because people don't trust the election workers to do what they're supposed to do. But if you think of the way an election works, right now the election people across the country are working overtime to get ready for November 3rd. Election day is going to be an enormous event. That's going to be a 15, 16, 18, 20-hour day. And in South Carolina, we are required to certify the results on Friday after a Tuesday election, which means Wednesday and Thursday are going to be busy times. People get tired, and the audit is simply one way of verifying that you've accounted for everything. And it doesn't have to be malicious intent. It just has to be tired people who make errors with a complicated process.
I would just like to kind of point out one of the things you mentioned, the kind of idea that, the things we see on the news every night don't necessarily apply to our states and, our kind of electoral context where we live. So can you talk a little about just kind of how elections work in America? Of course, they're very decentralized, but, what does that mean and what are the consequences of it?
So yeah, the Constitution leaves the manner of conducting elections to the states. There are some federal regulations that have been applied for federal elections, like the 30-day maximum registration period. Used to be a year. I remember when it was a year, and it was changed. Used to be 21 in order to vote. That got changed to 18. I remember that. Didn't have the chance to vote when I was 18. I had to wait until I was 21 to do an election. So I think one of the issues is registration. There are a number of states that allow same-day registration, so you don't have to register in advance. North Dakota doesn't have any voter registration at all. There is a problem with, there's certainly a contention these days about voter registration and what it takes, and whether the signature that you signed 30 years ago is the same signature that shows up on your absentee ballot. So that's an issue. The rules for absentee voting vary from state to state. Some states have no excuse absentee voting. Some states just have early voting, which is in some sense almost the same, although sometimes not labeled exactly the same in the legislation. South Carolina normally has 17 excuses for voting absentee. For the June primary and for November, the legislature changed that to no excuse absentee voting because of COVID. And I think Mississippi has the most stringent absentee voting requirements. If you ask for, and the whole question, a lot of the questions right now are all these mail ballots. In South Carolina, normally when you get a mail ballot, it is recorded that that was mailed to you. If it never arrives, there's a process for voting anyway. In California, I think if you get the mail ballot, you can turn it in on election day at your polling place and vote in person. That's not necessarily true everywhere. Certainly not normally true in South Carolina. Although for this election, if one is voting absentee, one can turn in the paper ballot and vote in person absentee, but I don't believe they can do that on election day, only absentee. So all of these rules are different. There's a lot of litigation right now over ballot drop boxes. South Carolina, we used to have one ballot drop box for the mail ballots at county headquarters, and somebody would have to check in the ballot and look at the signature, verify that there's a signature there. Some places like Maryland and Colorado have ballot drop boxes that look like mailboxes, and you can just drop them off. They're unattended. They normally have surveillance cameras. Our legislature said, no, we could not do that. So in my county, we have 6 satellite locations. One can drop off the absentee ballot inside the polling location after a person who attends the drop box verifies that it's a legitimate ballot. In Ohio, there's litigation because the Secretary of State has said no more than one ballot drop box per county. There's litigation in Texas over the same thing. I mean, all of this kind of stuff is different. And these are the kinds of stories that you hear on the news that may or may not apply. The other part is when those votes come in. South Carolina, the absentee ballot has to be in hand at county headquarters at 7 p.m. on election day. Other states will allow postmarks before election day, and the ballots can arrive late. And those things just vary all over the country as to, and there's litigation about that as well, as to when the absentee ballots have to arrive to be counted. And I think voters need to be very careful to check with their local officials as to what the actual rules are, because they're so different.
Great, thanks, Duncan. So a question from Abigail. Are there places to observe ballot processing in each state?
Generally, yes. Supposedly, in most states, the process of counting ballots can be observed usually at some distance. So in my own county, we have a tabulation room, and when the hardware comes back from the polling places, the tabulation is done in the tabulation room. Observers can look in, they can't be in that room. There is a lot of contention in a lot of places. There are some places where voters can actually be in the room, observers can be in the room watching things. And again, this is going to be at some distance, but a 6-foot distance is not the same as having to peer through a 4 by 12 inch window into a closed room or something like that. At one point in Colorado, the images of the paper ballots were broadcast on a TV screen as they were brought in. And voters didn't have to be there in the room necessarily. They could watch the TV screen from outside the room. So again, this varies greatly from one jurisdiction to the other. Most states do have a process for observing the counting of the ballots. Most states, maybe all states, have a process for having observers at the polling places. And this is currently something of enormous contention. We have just gone through the process in my county of making sure that the media know what the rules are. If one wants to be an observer inside a polling location in South Carolina, one has to come from a political party with a letter from that political party naming them as an observer. They're not allowed to talk to voters. They can observe. They can be there. They can listen to the voters giving their names as they check in. And in many states, there is a chance for the observer to challenge the right of a voter to vote based on residence or something like that. In South Carolina, they're not supposed to talk to the voters. So in 2012, when I was an observer and we had long lines, it took those people at where I observed, it took them somewhere between 90 and 120 minutes to vote. And there were a lot of people who came in who didn't have the right registration, and the poll clerks were overwhelmed. And there were 4 or 5 times I would stand there with the poll clerk running the operation and ask the poll clerk if I could help the voter with a phone. And the poll clerk always said yes, but I never directly addressed the voter until I was told I could. So those rules will differ. Almost invariably, it is illegal for armed law enforcement to be present at the polling place unless it's their polling place and they're there for the purpose of voting. And that's certainly true in South Carolina. And we have spoken. Our last Friday meeting of the Election Commission in Richland County, we spoke with the chief of police and the sheriff, and they were very interested. They know to be on call, and they're going around this week and next week checking traffic issues at the polling locations, just to make sure that they know that there won't be, huge long trains of automobiles because people can't park because the parking lots are full. So the answer is yes. Generally, voting can be, the ballot counting can be observed, but the rules will vary, and there are a few jurisdictions that people have complained have not measured up to their own law. I haven't seen that personally, but I have emails from people who claim that that's happened.
Thanks, Duncan. So a question from Matthew. What states do you consider most vulnerable to vote hacking, and what is being done to mitigate the risk? I think in 2020, we're expecting about 4 to 5% of people across the country to vote on paperless electronic systems that have, kind of no real backup. So what are the places where these are, the largest risk, and what are we expecting people to do to mitigate these concerns?
So let me preface this with debunking a statement that comes from some of the association officials, like the National Association of Secretaries of State and other people say, no, you can't hack the election because there are 3,000 counties in the United States and they use different equipment and you'd have to go after all of them. And that's just wrong. If you want to change the outcome, you target the places where changing the outcome would matter. And reading the news, we all know that Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Texas, Arizona are probably the primary battleground states, maybe Ohio. If you were going to target the election in Pennsylvania, you would target Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, because they vote heavily Democratic. If you're going to target Wisconsin, you go after Milwaukee. If you're going to target Michigan, you go after Detroit. If you're going to target North Carolina, you go after Research Triangle and Charlotte. So if you were going to try to hack something, there really aren't that many places you have to go after, because there aren't many places that would cause a significant change without having to try to hack 3,000 counties across the country. And what is so looking at that, the question is, are these jurisdictions secure? I know there are people, for example, in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia that I'm in contact with who are working to make sure the election officials do things securely. Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, was the only place I ever heard of that when they used direct recording devices with no paper backup, actually pulled one of the Ivatronics offline and did a bit-by-bit comparison of the firmware against firmware that they had gotten from the vendor that was supposed to be the correct firmware. I know of nobody else who did that kind of check to make sure that a randomly selected computer had exactly the software it was supposed to have. Those places should be doing audits. They should be watched carefully. And if there is hand-marked paper, it's easier to audit. If there are these ballot marking devices, one can audit the result of a ballot marking device. One of the problems is that most of the ballot marking devices mark barcodes, which are used for tabulation, and they print text, which is what the voter reads. And unless you go back after the fact and check that those barcodes match up with what the text is, then you don't know whether there's been a mistake. And we have the famous mistake from Northampton, Pennsylvania a year ago, where the barcode actually gave votes to an information box that had shown up on the touch screen that told voters that the process was different from what it had always been. It was just a software bug. But when they finally straightened that out, the judge who had gotten something like 164 votes in the initial count got something like 28,000 votes and won the election. So if there are ballot marking devices, they should be checking that the barcodes match up with the text. And you can do that statistically. If you run a bunch of them through a scanner, you get a count, and then you do a count of the text. And you can do that with a risk limiting audit. So that kind of thing should be done. It's not likely to be done extensively this election, but one would hope it's going to be used in the future, more places.
Thanks, Duncan. I think the example you mentioned is a good one. I mean, I think we hear a lot about hacking of election kind of systems and kind of hardware, but there's also, these really kind of just innocuous errors. There's just kind of programming issues. So for, the places that are still using these paperless systems, there's a lot of concerns just about innocuous errors that could lead to inaccurate results. So, some states that are still using these types of devices are Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Indiana, New Jersey, and Texas. So, not all of those states are expected to, be big swing states for the presidential election, but there's still a lot of down ballot races where these errors could be very impactful for, a lot of people's lives. And so it definitely, these kind of innocuous errors are in some cases just as concerning as, malicious hacking or something like that. And so there's still a number of places across the country we still have some outstanding concerns there.
Well, and in some cases, it's so in the analysis I did of the system South Carolina used to use, we found 2 errors in 2010 in the data that were still present in 2018. Software hadn't been fixed. And one of the errors was that if the central tabulation computer had a different list of contests from what had been shown on the touch screens in the computers at the polling places. So for example, if the voting computer in the polling place had only 1 county council race on it, but there were actually 2 for that precinct, then essentially all of the totals from that point on the ballot down got shoved up one line in the spreadsheet and added in, because they added in by position on the spreadsheet and not by matching candidate and contest. And that affects down ballot races more than the top of the ballot, because it is like county council or school board or something like that, where you're going to have more of them and it will be harder to notice. And these were just programming errors, configuration errors. They weren't malicious, at least, but I saw them pretty routinely somewhere across the state in 2010, 12, 14, 16, and 18. It was a bug that never got fixed. And those kinds of things can happen. The first time I noticed this actually was, I noticed a precinct that all the way at the bottom of the ballot, the Amendment 4, Constitutional Amendment 4, in a precinct that had 1,000 votes cast, had 0 votes for and 0 votes against. And I said, why is this? And it was, well, just everything got shoved up once, so the thing at the bottom of the ballot got 0 votes. And unless people are really actively looking at this and know that this is a bug, they're not going to be able to fix it.
Thank you. So we have another question from Zach. So can you comment on any potential future for online voting or any other possibilities for delocalized voting? What do you think about the cost benefit of security and accessibility?
So I will start with the sound bite that I use. I know of nobody who knows anything about computer security who believes that online voting is a good idea, except possibly for the people whose mortgages are paid for by a company selling online voting software. The National Academies 2 years ago came out with a report and said anything involving the internet and marked ballots coming back is too vulnerable to be used and will be too vulnerable into the future. And they just reaffirmed that about 3 weeks ago in a webinar. All of the federal agencies involved have said online voting, return of marked ballots is too vulnerable and should not be done. Every time somebody has looked at software for internet voting, it has been found sadly lacking in big ways. So there are 2 companies that are marketing online voting systems. And there's a graduate student, Michael Spector, up at MIT. Second paper was with Alex Halderman at Michigan. The first paper debunked completely one of the first of these 2 companies. The second one debunked the second one. I used the first paper in the spring in my course in software security because it was just a really well done example. Part of the problem is that none of these online voting companies are going to write all of their software. So they're going to contract. So one of these companies contracts with a facial recognition company for doing the facial recognition for authentication. And then you contract with a cloud service to store the data, and you contract with somebody else to download the data to the county. And my father was in the space program from 1951 on, literally learned rockets from von Braun and the Germans. And he told me that the problems in technology are very often in the interface between human brains, not inside one human brain. And one of the big problems in software security is that if you've got package X and package Y running, package X may think that package Y is checking everything. Package Y thinks that package X is checking everything. So X hands data off to Y and nobody checks. And that is a large part of what has been seen. These 2 big voting companies, Seitel, who wrote some code for the Swiss post office that Vanessa Teague and 2 colleagues found a problem with. Seitel did online voting in Norway, and Joe Canary and his people worked on that, demonstrated it was insecure, and in fact, some of the cryptographic stuff wasn't even being done. Vanessa Teague at University of Melbourne and Alex Halderman looked at New South Wales in Australia for an online voting system. They found a problem in the interface between packages that would have allowed votes to be intercepted and changed on the fly. Software is really hard to get right, and the internet is not a place to have marked ballots returned. Now, delivering unmarked ballots as PDF files or something like that the voter sees and prints out and returns by regular mail or some courier service, that's okay, that will work. But the return of marked ballots and the authentication of voters is too complicated to do over the internet.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I mean, Mike Spector's, a brilliant researcher, but, just he is a graduate student at MIT, and he disabled the malware detection and, one of those voting programs very, very quickly. So it's, as we're saying, it's incredibly difficult to secure these programs. And I think, we've seen a lot of discussion around, blockchain and how that enhances secure and how it's supposed to enhance security. That's largely been, debunked by experts. The National Academies report that you mentioned referred to blockchain as just another vector of attack for these voting systems. So blockchain is, a lot of publicity, it's good for marketing, but
it's the current shiny new word.
Yeah. So yeah, blockchain is woefully insufficient and just not designed to address the problems of internet voting. So another question from Matthew. So Are post-election forensics conducted in-house, or have private companies ever contracted for this work? Is one approach better than the other, and why?
So the post-election audits that I'm aware of have generally been done by the election jurisdictions themselves, not by companies. In terms of after the fact forensics, there have been a couple of instances in which obvious problems were looked at by entities outside the election jurisdiction itself. Now, in the case of Northampton, Pennsylvania in 2019, it was the vendor that looked at the problem because, of course, the vendor doesn't allow anybody else to look at their software. There was some attempt at forensics in Durham County, North Carolina. It was years after. So Durham County, North Carolina, 2016 had exactly the kind of voter check-in problem that I mentioned. Lots of people showed up to vote and they were told they weren't registered, they were registered in a different precinct, or they had already voted. And unfortunately, things were not seized instantly so that forensics could be done. By the time they got around to looking at the check-in process, it had been used several times since. And if somebody really is good at malware, they will remove all evidence of themselves on the way out the door. They will put it in, they will change something, they will cause disruption and erase themselves on the way out. And all of the good hacks that people like Halderman and Appel and Felton at Princeton have done have been exactly like this. So there are, could one do a private, so one of the online voting companies has contracted with a consulting company, a private consulting company, to do the post-election analysis. I'm personally a little skeptical of that. When you're buying somebody's answer, there is going to be a tendency for, even if it's only not looking hard enough, there will be a tendency for the bought answer to be the answer that is expected. Election jurisdictions are public entities. They can be sued as public entities. They have legislators looking over their shoulder. I think you have a better, a greater ability to focus eyes on things. And, you know, as Justice Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Yeah, I would say, you know, after the MIT researchers did that paper on kind of exposing some of the concerns and risk with one of those blockchain internet voting platforms, the company did hire a private contractor, Trail of Bits, to do an audit of that. And the audit, you know, even with the concerns you kind of talked about, confirmed all of the vulnerabilities and risks that the researchers talked about. So it is done in some cases, and it's concerning when all of those vulnerabilities are found even after time has passed and security upgrades have ostensibly been made. So I have another question here, a good question from Christine. So you describe many concerns with election security related to either intentional interference or unintentional error. Which do you think poses the greatest cumulative risk due to prevalence and the potential to go unnoticed?
Oh, that's that's a good question. So, and I would answer yes to both sides. In the places that are obvious battleground states and battleground jurisdictions, I think there is a significant threat from intentional interference of one sort, whether it's simply suppressing the vote by making it harder for people to vote by corrupting the databases. The flip side is jurisdictions that think they are so good at what they're doing that they don't check carefully enough. And the other of the two errors in our previous system was, so this was an error that if the voting computer was feeling cranky on election morning and wasn't opened until it was opened by a technician later in the morning, it is possible for that voting computer at the end of the day, when the poll clerk tries to close it, to say, I was never opened. And what happens is you have votes that have been collected that nobody knows are there because the exit tape says it was never opened. And the only way to check that is to look at the number of signatures on the poll book and compare that to the number of recorded votes. And you always have a few fleeing voters. You know, if you have 1,000 voters, you always have 1 to 5 who may have had an emergency phone call while they were in line and left. If you're averaging 125 votes per device and you're short 125 votes, that's a good sign that you haven't picked up the votes from one of the devices. And this actually happened to me in 2012. It happened in 2 precincts, and it happened to be serendipity. It happened to be in one of the precincts that I was that had the problem was the one I was watching. And when I got the data for 5 of the Ivatronics and I had 6 serial numbers, I called up the elections people and said, you've had one of these things go missing. So unless one is hyper vigilant to make sure that everything is correct, just unintentional error can be a big deal. And now is a good time to also point out, unlike a lot of things in science, elections are things where we have no idea what ground truth is. You know, when we're teaching chemistry to chemistry students and they pour things together, we pretty much know what they're going to get. And if they don't get it, we know they're wrong. I did my freshman physics class and I came up with gravity at 3-point-something meters per second squared, not 9.8. I knew I was wrong. With elections, you really don't know what the answer is. The only thing you can do is to count the votes and be hyper vigilant to try to make sure that you have accounted for all the possible errors. And so I would recommend, and this is one of the problems I've had with South Carolina, the South Carolina protocol seems to be written assuming everything is going to work perfectly. And chaotic events like elections don't work that way. You know, in the space program, there's a backup to the backup, and there's a backup to the backup to the backup. And if something doesn't work, they have a mitigation plan already in place before they start. And jurisdictions need to have that in place. They need to know what to do when things go wrong, because something will go wrong somewhere.
So we have another question from Paula. So is anyone developing a list of best practices to ensure election security?
Yes, there are lists out there. There are documents from some of the various federal agencies about things to do. We have a document from the state of South Carolina. I happen to think it is somewhat insufficient in that I don't think it addresses all of the questions of what to do when things don't work. And very often it's necessary to explain why. For example, a lot of people don't realize that a USB flash drive is a computer. And if you plug that drive into a computer that is allegedly never connected to the internet and get partial results and plug that into a computer that is connected to the internet, bringing it back is the same thing as connecting that central computer to the internet. A lot of people don't seem to understand that. And so just saying, do this, don't do that, often needs a little bit of explanation as to why. You know, what are the problems that you are trying to catch by having this as your protocol? So yes, there are best practices out there. I probably have a number of them squirreled away in my directory called voting/2020 election. I don't have them literally at my fingertips right now. But you know, competent jurisdictions will have all of that stuff planned out.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of people working in this space. I mean, elections are now considered essential infrastructure in America, so that's brought a lot of governmental support and kind of best practices. So the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has done a lot of work with election officials across the country over the last several years, working on their kind of cybersecurity back-end systems and those types of things to make sure they're a little more robust. So just at AAAS and EPICenter, most of my work over the last 2 years has been focused on working with election officials across the country, making sure they're aware of things like the National Academy's report, their big consensus report in 2018. And so lots of people are working here, but I think one of the big challenges is just how decentralized elections in America are. So you're working with thousands of election officials, working with different kind of standards and rules and guidelines, as Duncan's kind of outlined. It's very challenging in part because of how tremendously decentralized the elections in America are.
Yeah, and you really almost need a different FAQ for each state, because the process, and sometimes for different counties, because different counties, we use one system statewide. A lot of states don't do that. I think most states don't do that. So the process for using one piece of technology is not going to be the same as the process for using another piece of technology. And what you need really, and I tried to do this for this election, I tried to crowdsource all the questions that people had so that we could get a FAQ of not just the questions we would think of, but the questions the voters actually had. And to try to get a list of best practices, because they are out there. The FBI has worked with CISA and Federal Election Commission, the Election Assistance Commission, and there are documents out there that describe best practices.
So I have a question here from Matthew. So are elections underfunded? If so, how much more would significantly improve the integrity of elections?
I think in general, elections are underfunded, yes. That certainly seems to be the case in my own county, and it seems to be the case in a lot of other counties around the country. Part of it is the question of how they are funded, and because some of the money that we get in South Carolina comes from the State Election Commission, some of the money comes from the county itself, and some of it this cycle has come from the CARES Act for COVID mitigation. Some of it has come from direct funding for the elections. In general, as with most government agencies, they are funded kind of at the bare minimum of what they might need. And as technology changes, then things have to be adjusted. One of the other questions that comes up in terms of funding, years ago, some universities discovered that if they rented their main mainframe computer rather than bought their main mainframe computer, they would put the rental into a recurring budget and not have to go ask for $10 million. And so, South Carolina paid $51 million for the system we bought last summer 2019. In a situation, and that should last 10 years or so. The Ivotronic system we got from the Help America Vote Act money. But again, having to go hat in hand to the legislature or the county every 10 years for a huge slug of money is a lot harder than trying to get an ongoing funding. And some states have said, look, let's not buy, let's rent, because then we know what the cost is going to be. We can factor that into the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
How
I
much
think that's
more?
sorry, go ahead.
How much more? I don't know. I haven't looked in detail at everybody's budgets. I do know that we managed to get more money from my county, and that helped.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that we've heard from election officials that we've spoken to, over 1,000 over the last, 18 months or so, is that the need, as you mentioned, for sufficient sustained funding. So we tend to fund elections with these kind of, just bulk kind of money drops every, 2 decades or so. The Help America Vote Act, in the early 2000s, that was a huge chunk of money. More funding has come from federal sources in the last few years, but every 20 years makes it difficult to plan. In the meantime, people are scrimping and buying used device parts off eBay and kind of secondary sellers, which is a security nightmare. I mean, the election officials aren't they're willing to talk about these issues. They do need more money. They're cutting corners in a lot of places that they would like to not be cutting corners in. There's things like, looking at post-election audits, which we've discussed. One expert, Alex Halderman from Michigan, estimated it would cost about $20 million to do nationwide post-election audits, risk limiting audits, which are the statistically sound type of audits. So, I mean, in the grand scheme, American government spending $20 million annually on a check to ensure our elections are fair and accurate is a pretty good bargain. So it's shocking that is those are funds that we're unable to cobble together somehow. So another question from Matthew. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of centralized or decentralized elections?
So we are, I think, the only advanced democracy in the world that conducts elections the way we do at the local level. Virtually everybody else that I have seen has a national standard. We're not going to get a national standard for most things because of what's written in the Constitution. So the only way that something like that could get written into law would be the way that the drinking age got raised to 21. And that was by the federal government threatening to cut off federal highway funding if the states didn't raise the drinking age. So that's one problem. Now, we are also just about the only country that when we conduct an election, we will have an election for president and then all the way down to soil and water commissioner and referenda. Most countries, when they do an election, there's really only one thing on the ballot. And that makes it a lot easier to run an election. It makes it a lot easier. I mean, some places, for example, if what you're voting for is parliament and you're voting for a party, then you simply take the paper and you stack it in different stacks and you can count the number of pieces of paper you've got. That would be a nightmare. I can't imagine. I'm told New Hampshire does, I think it's New Hampshire does hand counting of everything on election night. New Hampshire's not a very big place. I can't imagine doing a hand count of all of the things on our ballots here in South Carolina. We had a dozen things on the ballot. Vote for one, vote for two for school board, things like that. Our ballots are complicated, which if I can, shove the knife in and twist it one more time, makes the software a lot harder to get right. If you only have X versus Y, the software isn't that hard. But if you have all these different things and different ways of voting, then it makes it a lot harder to run the election. I don't see us changing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the largest kind of political arguments about American elections is just how much kind of federal oversight there should be over the process, and that's something we've seen kind of argued about a lot in Congress. A question from Abigail here is, do you believe there's still voter suppression for people of color?
I am old enough to remember the Voting Rights Act. I was in high school back then, and Charles Stewart at MIT is the political scientist who does the post-election analysis every 2 years of the biennials for some conference that I forget the name of the conference, but it's held at William and Mary every 2 years. And he has consistently found that precincts with heavily minority populations have longer waiting lines than precincts without heavily minority populations. That would certainly indicate that there is some voter suppression simply by shortchanging those precincts on the amount of resource they have. This is one of the big complaints that came up in Georgia in its primary. And the evidence that I have seen, I'm not an expert on that evidence, but the evidence that I have seen certainly suggests to me that there's a there, that the minority districts were shortchanged in one way or another. It was alleged 8 years ago that this happened in Ohio, in places like Cincinnati and Columbus and Cleveland. I think whether it is overt or not overt, I think it is the case that minorities do have a harder time voting. And you know, the statistically, for example, the voter ID law that we have in South Carolina now statistically disproportionately affects minority voters. Long lines disproportionately affect minority voters because longer lines mean that people with childcare issues and transportation issues and people who work and get paid by the hour rather than on a salary are going to be less able to stand in line. And those social issues correlate with lower socioeconomic status, which certainly in South Carolina correlates with race. So I think whether it's overt or it just happens, certainly I think there is still voter suppression for people of color. There are complaints in Arizona about the suppression of the Hispanic vote. So there are too many complaints that seem backed up by legitimate anomalies in the data for this to not be something that needs to be looked at carefully.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount of, kind of research out there. He mentioned some work by Charles Stewart. Charles Stewart does, great work here. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of work on kind of vote suppression among, especially Black Americans. So relative to entirely white neighborhoods, residents of entirely Black neighborhoods wait about 30% longer to vote. They're 74% more likely to spend more than 30 minutes in line at their polling place. Generally, Latinx voters wait about 46% longer to vote than white voters, and Black voters wait about 45% longer. So, just this type of vote suppression making, it is more difficult to vote if you are not white in America just because of the time expenditure. And as Duncan mentioned, if you have, childcare responsibilities or you have to take time off work to vote, those are tremendous hurdles. Those are tremendous barriers to voting. So that's still an ongoing issue. And then we still see we have a disability gap in voting in America as well, where I think in the 2018 midterms, voting among individuals with disabilities was about, I think, 5% lower in the midterms. So there's still a number of places where we see groups in America having more difficulty accessing the ballot than others. So it's certainly a challenge that we're still facing. It's not gone away in a lot of cases. So we've only got time for, I guess, maybe one or two more questions, but one question I would throw out quickly: what do you think, Duncan, is the largest impact we've seen from COVID in this election cycle? Obviously, it's changed the way we do a lot of things. What do you think has been the biggest impact on voting in terms of COVID?
So probably the biggest impact is the huge increase in requests for paper mail-in ballots. In 2016, in my county, we had 15,000 paper ballots that got counted. We have mailed out in my county more than 50,000 paper ballots. This is enormous. And again, in talking with election officials, everybody I have talked with or read emails from has been preparing for this since about April. Since it was clear this was going to be a sea change in the way that things were done, they have been preparing. My county has bought another scanner. We have 35 people set up to handle the paper that's coming in. We arranged for a large room so we could do social distancing and separate people and just manage the logistics of keeping track of all that paper. So I think virtually every election official in the country knows there's going to be a lot more paper and is working to figure out how to deal with that. The other big change is that the in-person absentee or early voting is enormously larger. And again, I think it's people choosing to vote and stand in line when they would want to vote and stand in line. At a polling place, there's almost always a certain line at opening. The hope is it disappears by about 9:30, and there's a slack period until lunchtime. And then the lines disappear 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they don't show up again until after 5 p.m. So I think people are choosing to vote in-person absentee or early that didn't do that before. And even in South Carolina, where the term early voting is considered a 4-letter word, we have it by legislative act this time around. And so 2016 in my county, our in-person absentee votes were just over 40,000. We are on target to go up to about 75,000 in-person absentee, on top of 50,000 paper mail-in ballots. So I think those are the two biggest changes. People are voting ahead of Election Day, choosing when and how they vote, rather than be forced to vote on Election Day. And I have to say, I loved Election Day. Didn't always love it in South Carolina. I never voted in more than 10 or 15 minutes in Louisiana or Maryland or Ohio, and I never voted in a biennial in South Carolina in less than 90 minutes. But people are choosing to vote, and I think those are the two biggest changes, is we're seeing a change in when people vote and how they vote.
Thanks, Duncan. And so our final question is from Matt. So what are the arguments against automatic voter registration? Shouldn't we all be able to vote by virtue of being citizens?
This is not my area of expertise because I'm not a political scientist, but as a citizen, I don't see a problem with automatic voter registration. I think, the rumor we have always heard is that a lot of people choose not to register to vote because they think that's where the grand jury lists come, or the jury lists come from. I don't know that that's true or not. I think everybody who is a legitimate citizen in the United States with a residency should be able to vote. Yes, this is a democracy. This is who we are as a country. And how you would handle automatic voter registration. There are states that have started doing this, and it seems to work. So it's not something that is an insurmountable challenge because we've seen it work. So yeah, I would not be opposed at all to automatic voter registration.
Great. Thanks, Duncan. So it's 12:29, so I believe we're just about out of time. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today and submitting your great questions. There were a lot of really good ones here, and I also want to thank Duncan for spending so much time with us this I guess afternoon now to talk about his great work in voting. So we've definitely taken advantage of his expertise over the last 2 years, peppering him with questions all the time. So I'm glad you all were able to do the same. So thank you all for joining us today and have a great afternoon.